So, good evening. Welcome to Great Conversation. My name is Adam Rosenfeld. I'm a professor in the philosophy department here at UNCG. And today I'm going to be talking about the way that we interact with our technologies. There's a question that I want to ask, but I'm going to try to frame it first, because there are a couple of places where I think the discussion that'll follow the question that I ask, if I don't kind of prep us just a little bit, we might get kind of lost in some quagmires that don't get at the thing that is, I think, a little more interesting, really interesting. So, there are going to be three things that I'm going to mention after I'm going to ask the question once. We're going to do a little warm-up. I'm going to talk about technologies and humans and the relationship between them a little bit, just because I want to kind of weed out a couple of things that I think some people might want to say or talk about, but I'm going to say, like, ooh, let's not get mixed up in that just yet. I'm going to talk about a relatively recent theory called nudge theory, and it offers an answer to the question that I'm going to ask. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about choices and what it means to make a choice. We'll get just a little tiny bit into free will determinism debate, just far enough that I can say, like, let's not get stuck in that. Let's move forward. And then I'll ask the question one more time, and we'll talk about it. We'll try to answer it. The question is, can we make ourselves better or worse people through the way that we design our technological environments? And if our answer to that is yes, then how? How do we go about doing it? What sorts of principles, design principles, are we going to want to use in order to do this? That's the question. Think about it. Maybe write something down in your notebook if you want. We're not going to discuss just yet. In fact, we're not even going to get into the other stuff just yet. I just kind of want to warm us up in thinking about technologies influencing people. So I'll pop a picture of a technology up on the board. I just want you guys to tell me, what do you think this technology is trying to get us to do? And let's start here. This is a speed bump. In fact, it's the mother of all speed bumps. What do you suppose this technology is trying to get people to do? Don't be shy.
Stop us from going too fast.
Stop you from driving too fast? Yeah. Or slow down. I heard whispered over here. All right, fair enough. Not complicated, right? Yeah, this is pretty easy stuff. Spikes on a ledge. What are these trying to get us to do? It's trying to prevent thieves from kind of getting in through the window? Perhaps, yeah.
Prevent people from sleeping there.
It's to prevent people from sleeping there. Who would want to sleep on a window ledge?
Homeless people.
Homeless people, yeah. It's to prevent homeless people from sleeping on the ledge here. Here's a park bench. What is this trying to get us to do? Is it trying to get us to do anything? And maybe even we might think back to, like, this one that was not just about what it's trying to get us to do, maybe what it's trying to get us not to do. Yeah, so we've got a park bench. Maybe it offers a place to sit. Even offers a place to put your arms, but what can't you do here? You can't lie down. The armrests stop you from lying down. This is, if you think that's a mistake, it's not a mistake. That's an intentional aspect of this design to prevent people from sleeping on park benches. And perhaps that's what you want in a park, not people sleeping on park benches. Also, perhaps targets homeless people. Here's another bench, maybe even more extreme than the last bench. What do we think this one's trying to do? Does that look like a comfortable place to sit? Are you even are you even really sitting there? Just something to lean against. This is at a bus stop. We don't want people loitering at the bus stop, right? Kind of mucking things up. So yeah, this kind of keeps it relatively clear. If you're going to be standing there waiting, you got something to lean against, kind of to like half squat, but not to get too comfortable. Here's one. Here's a staircase right next to an escalator. The staircase, you'll notice, looks like a piano keyboard. It also sounds like a piano keyboard. When you step on the steps, it plays the notes associated with, like, where it would be on the keyboard. What do you suppose this is trying to get people to do? Trying to get them to take the stairs, right? Because it's fun. This is I don't know if that's a Fitbit, but it's like a Fitbit, right? Keeps track of how many steps you take throughout the day. What's that trying to get people to do? Exercise, yeah. Walk more, take more steps. Okay, fair enough. So these are all ways in which technologies, it seems like maybe we already have kind of like a little bit of an answer to our first question. Can technologies make us into better people? Well, all of these are trying to steer us towards a certain sort of behavior. Some of them we might think are like morally good. Some of them we might think, well, maybe not so morally good. Some of them are kind of like politically admirable. Some of them might be really politically problematic. But then again, we might get kind of sidetracked in this sort of conversation. There might be some folks who are a little bit skeptical about the possibility that we could talk about the morality or the politics of technological artifacts in the first place. They might suggest that, what's so moral about technologies? I get that people are moral, but are technologies moral? There are two big kind of approaches to this. They're very broad approaches. I want to kind of mention those and then mention a third one that I think kind of gets us past this question so we can move on to something a little more interesting. The first thing, and this usually is where the biggest objection to the idea of talking about the morality or politics of artifacts comes from a position that sometimes gets referred to as technological instrumentalism. And possibly the most famous articulation of this philosophical position towards technology is this old slogan, guns don't kill people, people kill people. This is the idea that any sort of technology is morally or politically neutral, and it just depends on what people do with it. We might even recognize that lots of technologies are pretty flexible. That bench that we said, you can't sleep on it, I bet you could sleep. If you really tried, you could sleep on it. You could try to slip your feet underneath the armrests. There's even a picture that was bouncing around someplace that I found that had a little foam thing that you can put on top of the bench that kind of has little inserts for where the armrest can go, and then you can sleep on top of that. Technologies are pretty flexible. You can do all kinds of things with them. This is a phone, I suppose. It's also a clock. It's also a flashlight. It's also a hammer for nails, I suppose. It's maybe not the best use for it. It's a paperweight. It's a frisbee. It can be whatever I want it to be, right? Technologies don't do anything on their own. It's only the people who do things with them. And they can do not whatever they want with them, but they can do all kinds of things with them, or not do anything with them. Perhaps opposed to this is the idea of technological determinism, there are a lot of a variety of ways in which we can articulate what technological determinism is all about, but probably the easiest and most encapsulating way is this idea that it's not us who makes the technologies what they are. Technologies make us what we are. That somehow our technologies determine what sorts of people we are, the sort of cultures that we develop. Sometimes this is articulated in a way where we can talk about technologies having a sort of teleological destiny of their own. We could talk about a spoon and what does a spoon want? How does a spoon want to be used? That's highly metaphorical. The spoon has no desires of its own, but it gets at this idea that you can't just do any old thing with a technology. And even if you could, it seems like the technologies exert a sort of an influence on us. Some Marxian philosophers and historians of technology will kind of take somewhat of a technological determinist approach to this. Folks like Jared Diamond have Guns, Germs, and Steel, if you guys are familiar with it. He's frequently been accused of being a technological determinist, even though he denies the accusations. So as I said, these are two kind of broad and I think somewhat extreme views on the relationship between humans and technologies. I'm going to give us a third option that I think kind of gets us through kind of a middle path. And it would be this idea that technologies mediate between human subjects and the world around them. And we can see we've got here's you, here's the world, and the technology is always going to be in between. And it's not just filtering, but mediating. Mediating is the right word. We have three examples here that show technologies mediating, and they're at kind of various points in this relationship between you and the world. So we have something like a blind person with a cane. This is a technology that mediates between the blind person and the world. And it also, it's very kind of tilted towards the you side of it, right? It almost kind of becomes incorporated into the blind person's body schema as they kind of walk around. It's an extension of their arm. The microscope is something that's almost smack dab in between you and the world, or the little corner of the world that you're exploring, right? And as you're kind of exploring it, the microscope, if you're really into it, the microscope will kind of almost disappear. It'll recede into the background, and you're just kind of looking through the microscope at what's on the slide, all the wonderful tiny world inside. Sometimes the technologies can be so far tilted in the world direction that they kind of become objects in the world themselves for us to look at. So a lot of times we talk about AI, especially AI that could fool you into thinking even momentarily that I'm talking to some kind of significant other here, is a sort of technology that not only mediates the sort of relationship that you have with the world, but kind of seems like it's out there in the world too. You're not using it, you're interacting with it. The idea here is that when technologies mediate between us and the world, they have a tendency to, maybe not even just a tendency, they necessarily amplify and reveal certain sorts of affordances. We won't talk about destinies for technologies because they are a little bit flexible. The techno-instrumentalists are a little bit right about that. But they do have affordances. They have certain sorts of trajectories that they suggest. And these are revealed when they mediate between us and the world. And other sorts of affordances that are reduced or concealed. Opportunities for action, opportunities for using the technologies. They suggest and kind of heighten or highlight certain ones, and they conceal or reveal other ones. And I think if we can accept that, then we can talk about technologies not inherently being good or bad, but not really being neutral either. That they're the sorts of things that do have some moral and political valences, even though they're a little bit squishy. Does that seem like it's an acceptable way to kind of get around this question of whoa, I don't know if the technologies do anything good or bad on their own. It's really all about us and the decisions that we make. It's a mixture, right? It's always us plus our technologies and the sorts of affordances that are revealed and concealed in that sort of interaction. Cool so far? Opportunity for any clarificatory questions? Yes, Garrett.
We are referring to technology.
Could somebody pass the microphone over to Garrett?
Just said,
Yeah, you can just set it in front of you.
So, we are referring to technology purely in a more modern sense, and not just in the sense of anything we use to navigate or modify the world, right?
That's an interesting question, yeah. And I'm not particularly picky about how we would do this. And there are some debates to be had about well, what exactly would count as a technology? Some sort of material object that mediates between me and the world seems like an obvious example. A lot of times people think of particularly quote unquote high-tech technologies or digital technologies. When we talk about technologies, I'm talking about laptops, I'm talking about the swivel, the projector, all of these sorts of things. It doesn't need to be that complicated. My glasses are a technology, right? And they mediate between me and the world. A walking stick, we mentioned that, the blind person's walking stick. So a stick that's laying on the ground, not a technology. I pick it up and I hike up a mountain with it. Now it is a technology. So we can talk about very low tech. A cup is a technology. A pencil is a technology. Where things start to get a little blurrier is if we're thinking about our social and political structures a technology, right? Is democracy a technology? Are the power structures inherent in the university that in the classroom, I'm the teacher, other people are the students, and there's a power dynamic there. Can we think about this as a technology? We certainly could. It kind of extends what the word can mean. Do you think of any, or do you think that there's anything in particular that's on the line here, Garrett, or are you just trying to get a little bit of clarification?
I was just trying to get a bit of clarification.
Yeah. Sometimes we could even go so far as to say language is a technology. That's about where I start to draw the line. And I'm all right, back up. I think that maybe goes too far. If language is a technology, suddenly I'm wondering, well, what isn't? Perhaps my body itself can be a technology. Okay. Step one, yes. Yeah, pass it around.
How you doing this evening?
Good, how are you doing?
Doing well.
Yeah, good to see you again.
I couldn't help but realize that you mentioned Taylor and nudge theory.
Yeah.
As an economist, that's kind of sirens to me.
Yeah.
Is this kind of going to be a justification of behavioral economics, or is it going to be within that context, or how is this applied?
I'm glad you asked that question. And I believe part of the answer to it is going to come up right now. So, if we accept what we just saw, that technologies do mediate between us and the world, they reveal certain affordances, or they highlight certain affordances, they conceal and kind of play down, sometimes maybe even foreclose certain affordances for action, then it seems like perhaps the answer is yes, technologies can make us into better people. And Sunstein and Thaler have suggested that, yeah, we've got an approach to this that does exactly that, and it's known as nudge theory. So some folks might already be familiar with nudge theory. My guess is there are some folks, just quick show of hands, never heard of it before. That's enough people that I'll go into it just a little bit. Near as I can tell, there are two major points that need to be articulated here when we're talking about nudge theory and what's going on with it. The first is this idea that there's no such thing as a neutral choice architecture. When we arrange our world, there's no way that we can arrange it that doesn't influence the way that we make choices at all. There's no natural way of doing it, right? Or there's no naked way of doing it. So here we have, and this is an example that Sunstein and Thaler, Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler use in the introduction of their book Nudge. It's a salad bar. And the way that we see the salad bar arranged here, some stuff's in the front, some stuff's in the back. What do we think people are going to grab more easily? Stuff in the front, yeah. The stuff in the front is way easier to get at. The stuff in the back a little harder to get at. Something's got to be in the back, right? There's no way to arrange this where like everything is equally easy to get at. And you might say to yourself, like, let's put everything in one row. There's no back, only front. Well, if you've ever been on a salad bar, you know that like the stuff at the beginning, you pile that on your plate. By the time you get to the end, your plate's already full. So the stuff at the end now is at a little bit of a disadvantage. So how do I decide like what goes in the front and what goes in the back? Let's not put anything in the front. Let's not put anything in the back. Let's put it all at the beginning. Well, now I've got the front-back problem again, right? There's just no way around this. There's going to be some sort of influence in the way that I have arranged this choice architecture. Something's got to be in the back. And if that's the case, may as well do it so that we encourage the best sort of behavior possible. So this opens the door of a certain kind of paternalistic attitude towards the way that technologies are designed, namely that if we think people are going to have a tendency to not make great decisions for themselves, or if we just recognize that there's no way to make a neutral choice architecture at all, then may as well make the choice architecture in such a way that it encourages the best sorts of decisions. In which case, maybe I want to put all the healthy food in the back. Sorry, in the front. Maybe I want to put all the healthiest parts of the salad bar in the front. The chopped hard-boiled eggs, the bacon bits, and the shredded cheese, that goes in the back. This makes it so that if I really wanted to get those things, I could, but it's a little bit harder. Now, some folks might object to this idea of a kind of a paternalistic, technocratic way of designing our environments by saying, like, but wait a minute, this seems a little manipulative. There's something almost creepy about this idea that people are designing our environments in such a way to get us act in like one way rather than another way. And even if we said, like, yes, but they have your best interest at heart, they're going to help you make good decisions, you might be like, well, who are they to tell me like that I can't have the bacon bits? And, well, this is something that Sunstein and Thaler refer to, or they think that they can respond to. They say, like, yes, a nudge theory is paternalistic, but it offers a libertarian form of paternalism. And they acknowledge that this seems like it might come across, at least at first, as a contradiction in terms. But the idea here is that if you really want to get around the nudge, if you really want to reach for the bacon bits in the back, nobody's really stopping you. This is it's coercive, sure, but it's a very, very soft coercion. And it's one that offers no kind of prohibition on doing the sorts of things that you want. So perhaps the example that Sunstein and Thaler use and that like lots of people talk about when they talk about nudges that I think demonstrates libertarian paternalism the best is the urinal fly. Has anybody ever seen one of these urinal flies before? Am I the only one? Seen it, like you've seen it in person, like in a bathroom? In the in Schiphol Airport, right? This, I think, was the first place that they used it. They have urinal flies as well? Okay, all right. Okay. Yeah, I saw one in a restroom here on campus, and then I realized it was an actual fly, not a sticker. But the urinal fly is a little decal that you put inside the urinal. The idea here was it was first pioneered, or at least first studied in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. And they had a problem with people, come on, guys. They had a problem with dudes peeing on the floor too much. And they were like, we wish there was a way to get people to not pee on the floor so much. Put just a little decal of a fly on the inside of the urinal. Holy smoke, does this reduce the amount of pee on the floor. And all it does is it provides just a little bit of a suggestion that says, like, hey, fellas, maybe you pee on the fly. So this is paternalistic in the sense that it steers you towards like a pro-social sort of a behavior, right? That you pee in the urinal instead of on the floor. It's libertarian in the sense that if you really wanted to pee on the floor, nothing's stopping you. You could totally do it if you wanted to, right? So this is the libertarian paternalism in Sunstein and Thaler's nudge theory. And this suggests that there is a way that like respects our various political intuitions about that we want government to kind of like help us to act better, but we don't want them to kind of infringe on our liberty. They don't want to like infringe on our autonomy at all. And so maybe this splits the difference. Maybe this gets us to a point where we could say like, We can totally use technologies to make people into better people, and it's not even creepy or manipulative at all. Yes, Garrett, if we can pass the microphone around.
So, could libertarian paternalism be thought of as a kind of like moral advertising? Like, we would like you to engage in this sort of moral product, but there's no obligation for you to do so.
Yes, yes, and some folks do talk about this as at least a subset of nudges, moral advertising as one sort of subset. In fact, you can even think of, and it's not clear that this would be entirely technological. This kind of gets into the territory that you were suggesting before, but any kind of commercial that makes a suggestion that, I don't know, maybe you donate money to starving people in Syrian refugee camps and shows you pictures of like starving children in Syrian refugee camps. This kind of gives you a little bit of a nudge. If you didn't want to donate, you don't have to donate. This kind of creates the impetus. You can look at it through the lens of this theory, and it's literally moral advertising. Heather? Yes.
I don't know that it's worth following up at the moment, but I just want to register an objection to paternalism.
Okay, yeah. In what way?
Because paternalism, a paternalistic action is an action that's not for the benefit of the person you're nudging. But if we don't want you to pee on the floor, it's not really for your own benefit that we don't want you to pee on the floor. Or it's not for your own
It's not
benefit.
only for your own benefit, right?
Right. Well, I don't know. I don't have experience. But if I want you to give money to starving refugees,
Yes,
that
that's
doesn't seem like the beneficiary there is me.
right. Yes, that's an excellent point. And it probably is worth pointing out that this is, I'm taking the term libertarian paternalism from Sunstein and Thaler, and the examples that they do use are focused towards this. It's this idea that, like, when we're nudging you, it is for your own benefit. They're giving examples like things to help people save money, things to help people enroll in the best health insurance program, these sorts of nudges. Although, that's interesting, because they mention organ donation protocol as well, and that's certainly not for the benefit of the person being nudged. Yes?
If the benefit then becomes like to the society, doesn't the whole idea of nudging kind of establish a relationship between like what benefits the individual benefits society, what benefits society benefits the individual?
We could certainly open, if anybody objected to this in the sense that we need to make a distinction between what's beneficial to me, the actor who's being nudged, versus the society that I live in, we could take an enlightened egoism sort of approach to it and say really, what's the difference, right? You have to live in the society, so for your own benefit, maybe make it the best one possible for everybody as well, right? I'm not at my best unless the people that I'm surrounded with are at their best, and they're not at their best if I'm not at my best. We're helping each other out, right? Okay, yes.
But in the example of Syrian refugees who are in refugee camps, they are probably thousands of miles away. How you're not around those people, and they're not necessarily in your society.
How tightly do you want to kind of
I'm not
describe our society, right?
Yeah, but how tightly? I wouldn't say that.
They're not members of my nation state, for sure.
They're not. But they're
We might be members of a global community or a community of humans.
or community of humans, but there's a big separation between where we live and where they live.
That's true.
And we may never see them, and their actions may never affect us, even though our actions might affect them.
Sure. That certainly seems plausible. Less plausible once we start kind of feeling the effects of, international terrorism, or if we recognize that the global economy is incredibly interconnected, or if we recognize that global climate is incredibly interconnected, right? Suddenly we care about everybody. So if we are interested in the suggestions of globalization, maybe we can deal with that. Ultimately, I'm not sure if that has much of a bearing on where we're going here. So we've got this idea, we kind of got past this technology's doing things. No, we do things with technologies. They mediate. And now we've got this idea of all right, so maybe if we have libertarian paternalistic, maybe that's not even the right word, sorts of nudges, we've got a way that we can talk about technologies making us into better people. But now we've got a new question. and this is kind of at the heart of what I'm trying to get at in framing the question the way that I am through these 3 points. When you get nudged in this sense that I've been talking about, that we've been talking about, are you actually really making a moral choice? And this brings us to this question of choices and whether or not we can make them at all. And this is the second pitfall. This is the last thing that I kind of want to mention before we open up into the discussion. Because once I start talking about, like, well, are we actually making any real choices? I'm sure there are at least some people in the room here are thinking to themselves, like, nobody ever makes any choices. We kind of have this potential of falling into a free will and determinism debate. And I just kind of want to see if I can move us past this. And I think in the process of moving past it, I'm going to expose something that's a little bit interesting and maybe kind of gives us a trajectory in the discussion that's going to follow after this. So the free will debate, if we're not already familiar with it, has a variety of possible positions that one can take. The biggest objection to the idea that we're going to be making moral choices through nudges would be, well, we never make any moral choices, right? All of our so-called choices aren't really choices at all. Maybe we'll call them schmoises, because everything is determined by past events and natural laws through some combination of nature and nurture and the laws of physics themselves. You're never actually making a choice. If we had enough information, we could predict every single action that everybody's going to make. There are no choices. Some folks might be a little slicker about it, and they might say, like, but the world isn't determined. At the quantum level, there's a whole bunch of, like, indeterminacy. In which case, like, maybe we get choice back. But if you've kind of, like, thought about this a little bit, you'll realize that, like, I don't really get any free will or choices through indeterminacy or chance either. That's not what it means to make a choice. And whether our actions are determined or whether they're a product of just chance, it doesn't seem like any of these are actually chosen or the sorts of things that we can be responsible for. This is one of the things that Professor Gert brought up in, like, her last talk here about moral luck, that if something is a product of chance, you can't really be held responsible for it. We can't say that it's been chosen by you. So either way here, it seems like, where are all the choices? Well, one of the positions we can take on this is libertarianism, not the same libertarianism as before, but a position that says you have liberty, right? You are... In fact, we might say that libertarianism supposes that there's two different kinds of causes. There are, like, the kinds of natural causes that are deterministic that physicists study, and then there's this other kind of cause that's kind of metaphysically different than the first kind. Agent causation, which kind of produces, branching causal chains where you can make genuine choices. We're supposing here that a genuine choice in the fullest sense of the term is possible. And usually even libertarians will say something like, choices can be made, but they're actually pretty rare. Most of the time, and most of the day, like most of us are just kind of sleepwalking through, not making any real choices. Occasionally, something will kind of come to a head and I'll actually make a genuine choice. I'll kind of zig instead of zag, and it'll be my decision. Not random, not determined. So these are kind of three broad positions. If you have studied this free will debate, you maybe know that there's another position that's relatively popular amongst philosophers these days, known as compatibilism. And compatibilism suggests that even if all of our so-called choices were predetermined, we could still talk about them being free. And there are two approaches to this, or there are many approaches to this. There are two main ones that I think reveal an interesting distinction in the way that we might want to think about nudges and the way that we might want to think about technologies making us into better people. The first form of compatibilism is one that's developed by John Locke. And he offers a thought experiment that I'll offer to you right now. Say I suggest that, like, we're going to take a little break. I'm going to get a sip of water. Anybody who wants to leave the talk right now, feel free to. Just get up and go right out the door. If you want to stick around, though, and kind of hear what the rest of them, join the conversation that's about to happen, then please, by all means, stay. And I'm serious. Like, if you'd like to leave, go ahead. If you'd like to stay, go ahead as well. Everybody electing to stay? Okay. Did you freely choose to stay? Maybe there are some influences. You didn't want to, nobody else was doing it. What if I told you that I had actually locked all the doors, and even if anybody wanted to leave, they couldn't? There were no alternative paths for you. You were always going to stay in the room. Do you still think that your decision to stay was free? And Locke suggests, yeah. This is kind of a deflationary approach to free will and to this free will debate that says, like, all we ever mean when we say that something is freely chosen is that you got to do what you wanted. So if you had tried to leave and found that the door was locked, then we would have said, your freedom was thwarted in that case. If you decided to stay and like you were happy about staying, it was what you wanted to do, then yeah, that was a free choice. Whether or not there were possible alternatives, and this is the sort of thing that the determinist is trying to kind of push on folks who want to talk about free choice or free will. They're saying, like, if there are no possible alternatives for action, then how can we say that anything was freely chosen? And Locke is saying, like, even if there are no alternatives, we can still talk about whether something is free or not. Another way of looking at it is, let's say you're rafting down some rapids, and there's a big boulder, and you're thinking to yourself, like, I could go to the right or I could go to the left, and the current to the right is incredibly fast and strong, and you're like, oh, I don't want to go there, I want to go to the left. You could paddle like hell and try to get to the left, but the current might still pull you to the right of the boulder, right? In which case, you did not go to the right of the boulder of your own free will. But if you were like, hey, cool, fast water, and you just kind of steered right for it, you'd do exactly the same thing, but you'd be doing what you want. And Locke says, that's all that's really going on with free choice. It's whether you get to do what you want or not. It has nothing to do with whether or not there are actual possibilities for alternatives for action. In which case, if all it is being able to do what you want or not having what you want to do thwarted, it seems like maybe nudges are just fine. If we're wondering, do you make an actual choice when you get nudged? According to Locke, you make as free a choice as any choices are free. Your desires are never thwarted. However, we can look at an alternative approach to compatibilism. Anybody who's here from my ancient philosophy class, we've been talking about something very similar to this in Aristotle. I'm going to give it through Harry Frankfurt's version of compatibilism. That does something just a little bit different and I think a little more interesting. He makes a distinction between persons and wantons, where he says persons have the sort of moral responsibility that a genuine choice really entails. And these wantons, not so much. Wanton, you'll get a sense of what a wanton is in just a second. It's not a dumpling in your Chinese soup. So he explains what this is through 3 different examples. We have an unhappy addict, we have a happy addict, and then we have our old friend, the wanton. The unhappy addict wants the drug, but they don't want to want the drug. But their desire for the drug is so strong that they really can't help themselves. What Frankfurt points out here is that we have 2 different levels of desire here. We have this first-order desire, the desire for the drug, and we have a second-order desire as well, a desire about a desire, whether or not you want to want the drug. I'm doing almost like a violent simplification of this. Frankfurt makes a distinction between desires and volitions as well, but I don't think it's important for our conversation. That's the unhappy addict. For Aristotle, it would be the acratic soul. The happy addict wants the drug, and when we say, like, hey, how about the fact that you really want the drug? They're like, that's awesome. Not only do I want the drug, but I want to want the drug. This is the happy addict. They have a first-order desire and a second-order desire, and we'll notice that their first and second-order desires are in concert instead of in conflict with one another. The wanton wants the drug, and when you say, hey, what do you think about the fact that you want the drug? They have no opinion on it. It never even occurs to them to think that, like, they can have some kind of value judgment about their desires. And Frankfurt points out that the unhappy addict and the happy addict, these are persons, but the wanton is not a person. Strictly speaking, the wanton can't be said to have made any real choices at all. They're effectively no different than a mere beast or a very small child or something like this. And we can also get into all conversations about whether or not we think animals, non-human animals, make genuine decisions. But a lot of them, it just seems like they are kind of acting on first-order desire only, in this way that we might be tempted to say that they're not really responsible for their choices in the same way that we'll talk about humans being responsible for their choices. What gets revealed here in this kind of teasing apart of different kinds of attitudes towards our desires, first and second order desires, is this possibility that the wanton is not really making any kind of choice in a morally significant way. And if we think back to some of the suggestions about what a nudge does, it's entirely possible that we could be nudged in such a way that we're being wantons, that you're not having any second-order desires towards what you're being nudged into. In fact, that most nudges are just playing on your unconscious biases and kind of steering you. They're designed to kind of like take over when your decision-making process, when your deliberation goes on holiday. Because we're kind of separating this, because we're suggesting now that we've got not just our desires and not just kind of like our unconscious implicit biases or habits, but also a step removed from this, where we're deliberating about this, where we're kind of, if we want to look at it in a slightly different way than Frankfurt does, we want to look at it in an Aristotelian way, we might say that our second-order desires are of a different kind as well. We might say that they're rationally chosen instead of chosen according to like bodily desire or mere animal desire. Kant does a similar thing as well. We could do that if we want. We don't have to. We just have to articulate here that there's this idea of like, what is the sort of person that you want to be? And can you deliberate about the relationship between your immediate desires and that other second-order desire or rational wish or whatever I really want to call it? And if that's what's going on, then it seems like not all nudges are going to be okay. They're not going to make us into better people because they won't really be addressing our personhood at all. They'll be treating us the same way that we would treat a mere beast or a small child. And this might be the sort of thing that we might hesitate about. Which brings us to my question again. Can technologies make us into better people? And how? And I want to suggest a couple of possible other sort of additional questions that'll frame our discussion here. We can start with this. What sorts of moral agents do we actually want to be? Do we genuinely object to the idea that we might sleepwalk through our lives and just kind of be nudged and steered by our technological environments into making quote-unquote good choices? Perhaps if there are any like really hardcore utilitarians in the room, you might say like the consequences are really all that matters in the first place. Who cares how we get there? And that's certainly a possibility. But there are others of us who might kind of suggest that like, this doesn't feel like being a good person. Having the decisions made for me, having all of my moral decision-making externalized into my gadgets and my environment. Here's another question that we might want to consider. How much deliberation is enough? Because as I suggested before, most of us are not consciously deliberating about our moral choices through most of the day. We're just kind of sleepwalking through it. That's kind of almost necessary. Even if we just looked at our food choices alone. Food ethics is an incredibly complex set of problems. Every time you sat down to eat, if you thought about all of the possible implications of the things that you ate and like, what is the right way to eat? And like, is this really good? Like, is it fair trade? Is it, what about the animals? What about the laborers and all of these things? If you had to do that every time you ate something, you'd be exhausted. I don't know if we would say that this would make you a better person. So how much deliberation is enough? There's got to be a point at which we cut it off. And last but not least, what sorts of technological design principles do we think we can apply here that we would say that, like, sure, not all nudges are going to respond to this thicker conception of choice that people like Frankfurt are offering that suggests that we need something more than mere freedom from constraint in order to say that we're making free, morally significant choices, the sorts that we might be praiseworthy or blameworthy for. What's going to get us there? If not all nudges will do it, what kinds will? It's to you now. Yeah, Garrett. Somebody could pass the microphone down to Garrett.
So, question as we begin. When you're saying, going back to the original, tech nudges make us better people, do you mean people as in defined by personhood just previous, as in those that have those secondary desires? Or, and also, do you mean good in like a moral sense, or good as in like we are efficiently capable of moving throughout the world and doing things that we have been assigned to or desire to do?
Sure. So on the first question, I'm relatively agnostic about it for the sake of this discussion. If folks want to suggest that we can talk about being a good person with a thinner conception of moral choice, I'm willing to entertain it. I certainly did want to suggest that there was a thicker conception as well. So if you were to kind of ask me, like, well, what do you think, Adam? I would say something like, yeah, I think Frankfurt's a little more right than Locke on this. I think we do want a thicker conception. And this would probably be, and not just mine, there are plenty of other folks who are jumping on this bandwagon after Nudge came out, have said, like, ooh, Nudge uses a really thin conception of choice. Maybe we want to beef it up just a little bit. So I would say, personally, I'm with the latter option in your first question. But for the sake of conversation, I'm willing to open it up to other sorts of discussions. Your second question had to do with, when I say good, do I just mean efficient or do I mean morally good? I'm not sure if... I definitely mean morally good, and I'm not sure what it would mean to say like a form of good that wasn't morally good at all. And we can think of all kinds of ways of like incredible efficiency that are really morally bad. If somebody was an efficient serial killer, the Nazis were incredibly efficient. At least they have a reputation for it. But I don't know if I would say they were good in a peculiar way that maybe even gets you into the Cookie Monster problem. Not the Cookie Monster, the Oscar the Grouch problem. Got the wrong Muppet there. But so if we have something like, if I say like a good serial killer, what is a good serial killer? Does a good serial killer kill as many people as possible? Or is a good serial killer the serial killer that like restrains themselves and doesn't kill anybody? It's kind of hard to tell what's going on. We might say the same, and I called it the Oscar the Grouch problem because you wonder like, what's going to make Oscar the Grouch happy? Well, he's happy when he's unhappy. Oh, so let's make him unhappy. Well, you can make him unhappy by this kind of like weird, kind of attempt to juxtapose happiness and unhappiness like that. We run into a similar sort of problem when we talk about somebody being good at being bad. Even though there are plenty of places. Republic 2 brings this up, right? In the myth of Gyges, we get the suggestion of, what if somebody who was awesome at injustice was let loose on the city? What would we do then? But I mean good in a moral sense. My camera's facing? It picked up on the other marker, I think. Hey. Here it goes. All right, I'll just stand in front of it then. See, they mediate. Like sometimes we tell them what to do, sometimes they tell us what to do. Was there, yes?
Yes, sir. So going back to Locke and compatibilism, where does like original protest fit into that? And I'm not, so if this one was locked, I'm not talking about the people who follow the person who walk out. I'm talking about the original protest.
The first person who decides to like go for it,
Right.
And they find that their desire is thwarted because the door is locked.
Let's say they threw a table through the window.
They threw a table through the window?
Original protest.
Yeah, then we would say, yeah, perhaps then they still got to do what they wanted to do, which was leave. We can kind of split the hairs a little thinner, and some folks do this with this form of compatibilism. We'll say something like, yeah, but maybe you wanted to leave through the door, not the window, right? Maybe you wanted to leave without having to throw a chair. So in that case, like that was thwarted. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, we could certainly go there. And in fact,
Bars on all the windows.
yeah, sure, yeah, bars on the windows and it's all locked. Yeah. As long as that's the thing about thought experiments. We can always tweak them to account for any kind of pesky counterexample.
Is that, I guess my question is that not, so we're talking about, it not being a nudge to stay in the room, would that not be like original choice as well though, or?
What do you mean by original choice? Is this a technical term?
Nope, I just pulled
Okay,
them
all right. I just want to make sure I wasn't running into anything. Heather, do you have a response?
No, that's not a case of a nudge.
Okay.
Because a nudge
Right.
affects your decision, not whether you can carry it out.
So if there was a person who is incredibly anti-nudge, I guess, and he decided to leave because you locked the doors instead of staying,
Yeah, a
would that
contrarian.
not be a nudge itself?
Yeah, that might have wanted to stay anyway, but they're like, because I locked the doors, they're like, no one's telling me what to do. I'm going out. Yeah, then I think and Heather's exactly right. The coercion involved here is like way beyond nudge, right? It's way too hard in order to talk about it being a nudge. The question is, what are we saying about this person's freedom and the sorts of choices and actions that they make? I think Locke's position on this would be, if they get to do what they wanted to do, then they acted freely. If they didn't get to do what they wanted to do, then they didn't act freely. Yep. Their staying would have been involuntary. Any other questions? Clarificatory questions? We can work backwards if we want, or we've got these three and the big one as well.
Okay,
Yes.
a clarificatory question about kind of first order and second order desire and kind of what you mean.
Sure.
For like an unhappy addict, like the first order desire of like wanting drug, is that like instinct, I guess? Because at some point of
You don't have to put it right in the face, yeah.
at some point of like going through like drug addiction, it no longer, I mean, I think there's a point where it's now like it's part, yeah, it's physiological, it's like part of like who you are. So does first order
Right.
desire, is that like instinctual, and then like the second order is like kind of like thought about it, like, oh, hey, like this is kind of what my body is telling me, but this isn't one of the ones.
It can be, but it doesn't have to be. You can be explicitly aware of a first, if that's what you mean. Does it like,
Yeah, yeah.
is it subconscious or can it be conscious? It doesn't really matter in that sense. It also doesn't, and one of the things that you were suggesting there is like maybe it's fixed and it can't be changed. That also seems to be the sort of thing that's up for debate. We might be able to say like it is changeable perhaps, but very difficult to change. You know, we might say that sort of thing. Yeah. Yes.
Did you use the term technological destiny earlier? When you
It's a technological determinism, but destiny wouldn't be like a crazy word to use there.
Well, you said something about a destiny of like, does this pen feel
Does the pen have a destiny? Yeah.
justified
It's
by writing or something like that? I was
Yeah.
gonna say, in the realm of traditional economics, we have something called the law of increasing opportunity costs,
okay.
which would say that this pen would be a lot less efficient building houses, you know, like building fences. than
Right.
Writing. Just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, and in the language, if I was gonna like try to translate between that and the language that I was using, I would say that the affordances of the pen for writing are like way more obvious and more disclosed than the affordances for building houses. Right? Yeah. And this is all an effort to say that like it's not that you can't build a house with a pen. It's just that you can't do it very well or do it easily. So people tend not to build houses with pens. Yeah. It's a little softer than destiny, but it's firm enough to account for the fact that like pens are probably going to be used for writing. Yeah. Yes.
So couldn't we then interpret that like what a thing is designed for also creates a nudge, and then I was thinking about the principle in psychology wherein like people have difficulty solving problems with objects because they don't consider them outside of their traditional usage.
Their normal use context.
And
Yeah.
so, could that then be a case in which, like, the pen that might have been able to help you solve your problem, due to the nudge of what it's designed for and, like, what you typically use it for, it nudges you in a bad direction? Because you're not able to do what it is you're attempting to do? Again.
I was with you for a second, and then I lost you at the bad part. Would you mind kind of running through it one more time?
Like, as in, because you're unable to move past what it is,
What it's typically used for?
what it's,
Yeah.
like, what the purpose, like, of the object is, what the purpose that society has kind of, like, created that object for,
Yep.
and nudged you in the direction to, you may be able to use a pen for other things, but typically we use a pen for writing.
It doesn't even occur to me because like part of its affordances are not in its physical design. Part of it is socially constructed by like how people tend to use it.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
So, like, would that then be considered, like, a nudge in a bad way? Because it in some way detracts from what you are able to do?
I think this would be on the fringes of what I would consider a nudge, which would be to say like I don't see any reason why we wouldn't necessarily extend the theory to talk in this way, but it tends to at least be used in the context of the ways that we're intentionally designing things, not the ways that their use contexts kind of evolve through a social process of like.
Okay. So only if you design something so that using it, except in the way it was specifically designed to be used, was in some way difficult. However you would go about doing that.
Yeah, or we could suggest like if it was design. I think where it would kind of more naturally fall into the normal conversations, and maybe I'm actually performing the very thing that you're talking about here, like the concept of nudge. How do we typically use it? And I'm like, well, typically it's used this way, and you're like, well, maybe we could use it in this other way, like a pen to build a house. I'm like, yeah, sure. Why not? But typically it does get used in the sense of talking about the way that we build an object so that it kind of like all on its own, right? Without necessarily the social context. Although that starts to get into territory where you'd be like, there's no such thing as a technology outside of a social context as well. That'll come into play. It adds another wrinkle into like human technology world relationships. There's also some social construction of like all of the things involved there. So yeah, that's certainly part of the story. I think so.
I just want to clarify real quick. You said
It's-
teleological destiny, right?
Yes, I did. And just one more word to Garrett. It's a little harder to control those structures, though, right? It's a little harder to control the design if part of like the way that that a technology suggests its possible uses is socially constructed. And I think a lot of times, or at least the argument that I would make for kind of not bringing nudge theory to bear on that is because it really is kind of difficult to talk about the way that we would intentionally design the socially prescribed uses of a technology.
Can we think of like propaganda and advertising as ways in which we direct?
Sure. And again, we're on the fringes of what would count as technology as well. Yeah. Yep. Not necessarily a different conversation in kind, though.
I
Yes.
just want to clarify, it was, you said teleological, and I thought I heard technological. I just want to
I probably did say teleological when I was talking about, probably when I was talking about destiny, right? The telos or goal of something. Ah, yes. Okay, fair enough. Yes,
I
Heather.
want to go back to the question that you began the discussion with, which is whether or not
Yeah.
Technology can nudge us, whether that would be morally helpful, I guess, in the sense that
That question,
when
yeah.
we rearrange things, then there's maybe with some question that maybe our moral choices have been taken away, so we don't get the moral credit anymore.
Right.
So I wanted to flip that around.
Cool.
Suppose that there's a nudge in the direction of doing something you ought not do, and I think there ain't a bribe, for instance.
Okay,
I
yeah.
think our inclination in that case is to say, yeah, you made a moral choice, and that was not a good one.
Right.
So I wonder if that has a bearing on the religion.
Yeah, I think I think the coercion involved in a bribe is maybe soft enough to count, right?
Okay, you,
We would
you can change it if you don't like it. If a bribe's too
No.
hard, you can
Yeah, then we can imagine like what would
you can make it up.
Yeah, if we made it like a little sneakier, right? If it was some kind of something that was playing on our psychological biases to get us to do something that was wrong, would we say that we were not responsible? So and you would say that no, you would still be responsible even if you were manipulated into doing the wrong thing.
In a nudging manipulation.
And in what sense? Like, would we say, because there's at least one sense, so back when we were talking about like the wanton and to be precise about it, we might say that like, well, wantons don't really make any free choices of their own, but that doesn't necessarily mean they get off the hook morally, right? We might say something like, the wanton is not responsible, but we should expect them to be responsible. We might shift this came up in Ancient today, we might shift the term to irresponsible. With that, they're, just not a person, but they're capable of being a person. Somewhere further back, they decided not to develop the capabilities that distinguish them from mere beasts. In which case, then I might say that somebody was morally responsible for not being a responsible person. Is that the same sort of thing that we might say if you're just not vigilant, right? If what we're talking about is you've been nudged subconsciously into a morally bad action, and we say there's good reason to suspect that like you would have avoided that and not fallen prey to it. Is this what we mean when we would say that you would still be responsible?
I don't know. So
Yeah.
this interesting thing, it turns out that, I'm trying to think of a nudge. So here's a positive nudge, maybe you can
Okay.
one a parallel negative nudge. So it turns out that if you put out like apples or something that people can take, but there's a box you should put money in, yeah?
Yeah.
And if you make a sign that has eyes on it,
Yeah.
just pictures of eyes, I mean, it doesn't have to be like menacing or anything. Just put something on it that looks like eyes.
Yeah, sure.
You will get a lot more people to pay.
So that's interesting.
That's a nudge.
Yeah.
But so surely they're, so what if I intentionally take the eyes off of it or something? I don't
Right.
know.
Or I was thinking, yeah, the reverse version of that I was thinking is like the folks, since we're just a little bit past Halloween, the folks who put the big bowl of candy out on their front porch and with a little sign that says, please take one. You're almost begging to have somebody just like dump it all in their pillowcase, right?
Okay. Or, professors, this online test is closed book. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there you go.
Although I wonder about this if I would say that I'm nudging people towards bad behavior in those cases. It might be more that I'm taking away the usual barriers to bad behavior. And what we've revealed is this person has a desire to cheat or steal the candy, right?
Maybe,
And
but that, maybe.
and that they're no longer constrained in the ways that people usually are.
In the candy case, the more complicated case about the online classes, there's reason to believe that your grading will be influenced by how others do. If I choose not to cheat, that I may be at
A disadvantage, right? Yeah. You've got like a prisoner's dilemma problem now. Yeah.
It may be that in other contexts I really wouldn't cheat, but that
That's a really provocative suggestion. I'm going to have to like think about that. Yeah, because it does seem like there's an asymmetry there, and I wonder if it. I think I might share your intuition that folks would still be blameworthy for being nudged towards bad behavior.
I don't share your other intuition.
Which one is that?
Your intuition seems to be that they're not.
That they're not praiseworthy for being nudged into good behavior.
They still are.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
Can you talk a bit about, when it seems like everything is so, it's very transactional, can you talk about the element of time, so morality and the ability to decision make is something that isn't good?
Could we pass the microphone to him? Because that was a little bit quiet, and I'm not sure if it could be picked up. Which is going to mean you're going to have to repeat your question. Sorry.
If I can repeat it. So can you talk to the element of time?
Yeah, can I talk to the role of time in this? In what sense? Do you have an example that would kind of clarify where time becomes relevant?
So everybody in this room, the idea of moral decision making, if you ask them what it is, they probably have a different answer.
That's true. Yeah, yeah.
Based upon what they were told from their parents or teachers or their environment. So I'm just curious, what we're talking about seems very transactional.
So historical time. That's what you mean, right? That like in different eras, different sorts of moralities seem to like they might be holding sway.
Yeah, I mean, science, technology is the manifestation of million years.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't present, maybe our parents or ancestors were. It's a big question.
Yeah, sure. That is a big question, and I don't know if this will be satisfying. I'm going to answer it by dodging it. I think that like the account that I've given is actually pretty neutral about what sort of moral framework we would bring to the party. It just insists that you do reflectively deliberate about morality, right? That there's that separation between first and second order desires, perhaps. So this thicker conception of choice requires, and like exactly what we would decide are like choice-worthy second order desires. That might very well be decided by the sort of moral framework that we bring. And maybe this is kind of historically constructed. As a philosopher, I get a little bit itchy when people suggest that like morality is like an historical accident, right? It just kind of like changes throughout time. I'm kind of like, no, I don't know about that. Same that we would maybe kind of get the same sort of itchiness about the idea of scientific truth, right? Or like changing over time. We would say like, no, we're discovering it. We're like our attitudes towards the world are changing. But I don't know if I would necessarily say that the world itself was changing. We could say the same thing about morality. But whether the way that I decide what sorts of second order desires are choice-worthy is something like I want to know if they can be universalized, or I want to know, are they going to bring about the most benefit for the most number of people, or the least amount of harm for the most amount of people. Or if I think, like, how am I going to develop my character and flourish? If I think about how am I going to develop caring relationships with the people around me. These are all various ways of talking about what would make a moral choice morally good. And it doesn't really matter necessarily, at least in the account that we gave. We could just say, like, as long as you do stop and reflect. And we don't even necessarily need, I would be inclined to suggest that this is the process of deliberation is in fact this kind of trying to like apply a principle to decide whether or not your desires are desirable. But it doesn't necessarily depend on which principle you use in order for that account to still work. Yeah, please.
So for instance, the idea of Maslow's hierarchy, and if you assume up the hierarchy of needs and morality of that to a certain extent, the first
Presumably, like less egoistic, right? Yeah.
so the concept of morality is somewhat more.
Sure, or your moral beliefs would morph, right? In fact, we might say that like that's a moral hazard that's imposed by people not having their needs met, right? We would say that it's difficult to be a good person when you're not getting all of your needs met. There's an incredible incentive to look out mostly for yourself, right? But I don't know if that would say that. I don't know if I would say that that means that morality itself is changing. We would just say that like the person's beliefs about what is morally good would change. We might even say that there are objective contexts, like differences in context between somebody who's not having their immediate needs met and somebody who is. We might say something like the moral responsibilities of the person who is not having their needs met are not the same as the moral responsibilities of the person who is having all of their needs met, or even higher order needs. We might say something like, we expect from people what they're capable of giving. Yeah, sure. Did I speak to the things that you were curious about? Okay. Over to Garrett again.
Anyone else?
Yeah, feel free. Anybody else like jump in? Yeah, Francis,
I mean, so imagine two people.
doing
The
it.
first person's incredibly lazy, but wants to be a good person. We'll call that person Francis.
Okay.
Francis is lucky enough to live in a community that has arranged technology so that she can go through life, and because of the nudges she encounters, can be, do good things constantly. And she doesn't have to ever worry about actually making a decision.
Yeah, because the decisions have been made for her.
Yeah, at least to some extent, the nudges make the decisions. Versus the person who, who just wants to be a good person, is not necessarily lazy. But sort of figures out what things are good to do and makes those into habits.
Yeah. So is a
habit is a kind of internalized.
a way of shortcutting deliberation, right?
It's a way of shortcutting
Yeah.
deliberation. So, are they both at the end of the day equally good people because the process that they both use is sort of consistent and based on that desire to be a good person?
Sure. Is your intuition that they should be the same?
No, because I think the incredibly lazy person hasn't even invested enough time to figure out if the nudges are nudging towards good action.
Whereas the person who developed the habits presumably developed them intentionally?
Yeah.
What if they were raised by their parents to have those habits and didn't develop them themselves?
I would also have
Then-
the same hesitation.
That you wouldn't call them the same?
Yeah, I would say there needs to be some sort of deliberation.
There would need to be some sort of deliberation, right? Yeah. Heather, you have a response?
Well, I think, first of all, you are one of the least lazy people I know.
It's a different Francis, yeah.
Just in case there was a misunderstanding. But I think one thing that's important that goes a little too fast there is that emphasis on lazy. Because either of those people, if they don't really put any efforts into things, are not going to
You have to follow through on them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not sure how much difference that makes, but it does, because the other one sounds like you're not doing anything. You would really have to do things. And so that's why I think it's, in both cases, be morally good, because if you're going to really be morally good, you have to really be putting in effort. I mean, you have to really do it. And you have to be much more automata-like than that original description for it not to be true. I think.
Garrett, did you have something to add to that?
Yes. My question was, what exactly do we mean when we say lazy here? Because, like, lazy is an interesting descriptor. Like, is it lazy if society presents you with a recycling bin and a trash can, and, like, you still recycle because society has made it easy, but you didn't really go to a lot of effort.
Yeah.
You still made, like, what is ultimately the morally beneficial choice. Like, what if you go through life doing that, like, but you don't ever go to extreme lengths of effort? Like,
Right.
are you still good? Do you fall into, like, well, you didn't hurt anyone?
Are you better if it's harder?
Yeah, like, does
Yeah.
hardness necessarily mean that you are morally superior?
I don't think so necessarily, and I think we're starting to kind of like wind our way towards like answering these sorts of questions about like the sorts of design principles that we want, right? So, for example, making it easier for people to do the things that they think are good things to do, right? If we suggest that somebody recycle by making the recycle bin available, I haven't taken away any opportunity for you to think to yourself like, hey, I should recycle, right? So the decision, right, the deliberate choice is still there. You have to decide to like put it in the recycle bin rather than someplace else. Whether it took a kind of a heroic effort to get to the recycle bin or not, that might be the sort of thing where like I would adjust my praise and blame accordingly, because I want to kind of like reward people that go to greater lengths. But I don't know if I would necessarily say that one was better than the other. It reveals something about the character of the person who went to the greater lengths, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person who didn't go to the greater lengths doesn't have that same good character. They just didn't have an opportunity to show it yet.
Okay. I also had one particular like thought idea in mind that I wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
So I read about this a while back, and it revolves around the principle of self-driving cars, and the idea of like once you introduce self-driving cars, you have to introduce crash algorithms.
Yep.
And like, what is it going to crash into, and under what principles?
And the sorts of decisions that we'll have to make there too, right? Yeah.
Decisions that we'll have to make, and so like, if somebody buys a self-driving car, knowing, for example, that in the opportunity of a crash, it's going to make the decision that will save the most amount of lives, even at the cost of their own, and they make that decision to buy the car anyway, but then of course, like, in the decision of the crash, they would like, obviously, they've changed their mind in that split decision, but too bad for them.
Because the car made the decision to like sacrifice the life of the driver,
Yeah.
and not the the nuns crossing the street, right? Yeah.
And so like, originally the choice was theirs, but then like, does that do something to their moral choice if like the follow through of technology inhibits your ability in the moment?
To make the decision, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the interesting questions that this raises, and great example, thanks for that. One of the interesting questions that this raises is which of those two contexts seems the more trustworthy one to make the decision? The decision that you make, if you know that the crash algorithm, and let's suppose that you do know that the crash algorithm is going to say, in a choice between like driving off the road and potentially killing you, the driver, and like plowing into like a whole bunch of people who are crossing the street, the crash algorithm is going to crash the car and like sacrifice your life. And when you look at that in the cool and objective, like sober light of the car dealership, which is a great place to make decisions, right? You say to yourself, that's the right choice. You might even like apply a sort of like a utilitarian principle to it, right? And then in the heat of the moment when the car is about to crash, you say like, I changed my mind, I want to save my own life. which of those two is the more reliable context for making that judgment, do you think?
I suppose, like,
I stacked the deck a little bit by the way I described them, but
I don't know, it assumed, I guess the question asks is like, can you be like expected to be as moral when your own self is in jeopardy, and like, in what ways should we hold ourselves to being most moral, I guess the question would be.
all right, yeah, sure. I don't think it's particularly controversial, and for that reason, I'm going to just say that this is what I believe and do it unapologetically. I think being moral requires that you're prepared to make some level of self-sacrifice for the good of others.
Yeah.
Whether it's your life or not, that's something that might be up for grabs. But if personal benefit always outweighs the benefit of others, I think we might have a problem there, right? But the other thing that you were pointing towards, and maybe this kind of gets at a different approach to the time question as well, is this question of like if my earlier self makes a decision for my future self, have I taken the decision away from my future self, right?
Like, have
Yeah.
you been robbed of like your choice in like does my choice now?
Yeah.
Is that like locking the door? Except I did it 20 years ago when I bought the car, and I didn't know I was locking the door. But
Well, if you didn't know, then I don't know if it was like deliberately chosen, right? If it's a schmois made in ignorance,
well,
then
I mean, I didn't know it in the fact that I didn't know that it was gonna come up because I didn't plan to crash, but I knew that it was a possibility.
you knew that it was a possibility, right? And at the time you said, I think this is the right thing to do. I'll program the car to do X, right? And then in the moment you say like, oh, I wish I didn't do that. I think that this is an interesting question. It gets into this question of the sorts of design principles that I think would be good ones. And I think, for example, a way of like a kind of a self-authorized nudge, like a reminder, can work this way, right? A self-authorized nudge that's kind of like a message from your past self to your future self, or a decision that your past self makes that's going to make an action easier for your future self. That seems like you still did the deliberation, right? Presuming that your past self and future self are the same person. Yeah. I think if we can agree with that, then I think we maybe avoid any kind of trouble, and it suggests a possibly good way of arranging our choice architectures, about one in which we say that if you're making a decision as your past self for your future self, that seems like maybe that one's okay, and it could work. If it's somebody else who's making the decision, if I buy the technology without ever doing the deliberation myself, then that might be a problem. Yeah, Wade.
You're talking around Odysseus and the Mask, and that's one of my favorites. The whole idea of locking your future self in, we think that's actually a good thing.
Yes.
As in the story where Odysseus wanted to hear the sirens but not be lured onto the rock, so he had himself tied to the mast and told his crew, don't untie me when I cry to be released later, because my future self will be under this sort of coercion.
Yeah.
We do the same thing we do living wills.
Yep.
I think we know where we're facing incapacitation or potential diminished capacity.
Yep.
In some ways, marriage is the same sort of choice. You're binding your future self in some important ways.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of things that we do. Right. So I think we do this a lot. And
Yeah.
We shouldn't make too much of the ability of past self to bind future self.
I don't think so either. In fact, I think it's an excellent way to do this. And notice in all of this, Odysseus, and part of it involves like knowing yourself, right? Odysseus knew that he wasn't up to the challenge. It wasn't like he was shirking the responsibility to build up his willpower to resist the sirens. He was like, there's a really good chance I won't be able to do it. I know myself. I will make the decision now so that like I won't make it under duress later, right? And possibly make the bad decision.
This is what I did with buying the watch that I did, so that it nudges me to stand and it tells me to go for a walk now. And,
Yeah.
Because I know myself, I would just be over there at the cookies and eating those, when it sort of tells me go walk and so forth.
Yeah. So this seemed reasonable. We wouldn't call you a wanton because like you did make the decision once upon a time. Yeah. And this means that you don't have to like be deliberating constantly throughout the day every time an opportunity for action comes up. As long as you deliberated at least once. And I think we might also want to suggest that like you revisit the decision periodically as well, right? That they're like, if you have something like that where you program the nudges on your watch, right? And it even gives you like a push notification that says you need to renew your settings because like I'm just going to turn it off if you don't renew your settings every month. Causes you to like reevaluate the way that you've set it up. Yeah, that could be the sort of thing that prescribes exactly the sort of responsibility and kind of like deliberative choice that I think we can expect or even demand out of ourselves. That sounds about right. Yes, in the back corner. The microphone, please. Yeah, if you just put it near you, it'll be fine. It's working.
Well, my first question is I don't think confused as to where you define technology at. You're talking about something physical or you're talking about something abstract like deliberation. And then the second thing I was wondering was, you guys are bringing moral choices and all sorts of stuff on an individual, holding them accountable, right? You're talking about different measures as to what they're doing.
Yeah, or we're wondering whether somebody can be held accountable in certain circumstances based on whether or not they made a genuine choice. Yeah.
Okay, so now this is very interesting because you can make a choice and still it takes time, and in that time,
Making the choice takes time, that it's a process?
as in time and in cost, doesn't value.
Ah,
So
okay.
When you do nudge, when you do this nudge, in an abstract sense, that's the requirement, right? Now, I honestly believe, this is just my opinion, that nudges should be used to prompt curiosity
Mm-hmm.
and self-reflection and all that stuff. And
Yeah.
That's fine. But there are a lot of different types of nudges that do react negatively. It does showcase a lot of the confusion as to what morality is. Now, especially specific to an individual. Now, if we're talking about social morality, it's very different because now we're talking about social dynamic. We're talking about routine dynamics, we're talking about extremism, we're talking about polarity. Now, back to the whole individual nudges. This creates a very interesting thing because let's say you choose to enact an action and if you don't have enough attention. Or maybe you have too much energy and you overdo it. Right? So moral choices itself is very interesting in the sense of what defines a good action and what defines a bad action. And this is also related to how society views that action as well. Now, this is what makes it so complicated. So we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about psychology, we're talking about sociology, and then we're even talking a little bit about whatever that one is, about studying organism itself.
Biology?
No,
Physiology? Medicine? Yeah.
this is very interesting because nudges are good. But when you have too many nudges, what does that create? It's stress. Now, what happens when you're very stressed out? Well, I mean, I guess you often speak around that.
Yeah.
Now, this creates a lot of moral choices. The moral choices themselves are very interesting because you're a sociopath. You don't give a shit. You're going to kill everyone, right?
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, you don't have emotion. You don't know. And I guess that's the human regulation of what's good and bad that relates into feedback of dopamine and whatever the other one. So pretty much we're all kind of addicts in a sense, and we all like to gamble in a sense as well. So morality is very interesting in the sense of what you deem worth the real.
I suppose so, yeah. And I might insist that there be some. I like the way that you said provoking curiosity. I think you and I are probably pretty close on that. I wasn't sure if you were kind of blurring a distinction between description of human psychology or physiology or any of these other things and a kind of a more prescriptive register when we're talking about morality. So I would suggest that maybe perhaps they're two different questions, and there are a variety of ways that we could get to it. But yeah, on the one hand, we're talking about what people do or can do, or tend to do, or how they can be manipulated. On the other hand, we're talking about how people ought to act, and those seem like they're like slightly different contexts. But I do think that the second question, and one of the reasons why these things have all been brought together, is this recognition that the way that we expect how people ought to act should probably take a serious look at how they do tend to act, right? We should know a little something about like human nature before we start making prescriptions, because it would... Right, and perhaps the individual, as was brought up when Wade was talking, the individual should know themselves as well. Yeah. Right. Some of them are quite public.
Right, but in the sense of choosing to act, like freedom of choice.
Yes, that seems to be a personal thing, right?
Individual aspect.
Right.
So,
Which is why we would bear responsibility for our choices, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So my question was, how does society do something so personal without knowing the individual person? Right here.
Francis, Garrett, do you have a response to that, or?
Clarification first. Are you saying how do we judge like the personal nature of morality without truly being in that person's situation?
Well, I mean, it's a very broad question. What do you think is the most interesting way to answer it?
Like I'm asking, can you clarify your question again?
Yes. I think that
Okay.
choice is personal, right? And in that personal sense, we've created a social sense of personality, right? And then we characterize people on that idea of social personality. Now, this is where a lot of different aspects happen in the anti-culture. And then we get the mainstream culture. And then we get something in the middle where people don't know. Now, he brought up a very good thing, which was, if you don't know yourself, like you need to know yourself. And that's what the game is the unknown. And in fact, not really necessarily what they do, but how they affect the whole. But back to the whole personal and social. Yes. What gives society the right to judge morality for an individual themselves, other than through shared experiences and ritualistic kind of things? You know what I mean?
That's a slightly different question than the one you asked at first. Yeah.
I think the first question he asked was like, how can we, and not what the second question was, which is, do we have the right?
Yeah, well, yeah,
How do
so...
we address that?
Well, let me address the first one. How can we? Never perfectly, right? I don't know exactly what's going on in your head when you make decisions, but I'm not completely blind about it either, right?
Mental model.
Right. Yeah, I do have a little bit of a theory of other minds, and I assume that your mind works more or less like mine. Maybe we even like get together with lots of people and we construct a common theory of minds based on something that like everybody agrees, like, yeah, that's more or less how my mind works too, right? And between like behavior and use of language, which is itself a behavior, we can get a pretty decent idea of what's going on in somebody's head. So when somebody acts in a way that breaks a moral norm, we can ask them, what were you thinking? And they can tell us, and we can say like, yeah, that's not okay. We're gonna punish that behavior.
Right?
Yeah, all right.
How should we punish that individual?
Can you clarify?
Well, zero in the box is language, right? So you know what you're dealing with when you identify that. You know what I'm talking about?
Explain yourself.
I'll just give you a high five. Eric, reference to
Yeah.
that none of you are in.
So this is a Wittgensteinian thought experiment. Yeah.
Yes. I'm not actually sure if I want to. The thing I wanted to say is connected to some of your concerns about the social political dimension, but I'm not sure if I can connect it directly to the view of the box. But maybe it does. And you can
Maybe we can build a close enough bridge that we can jump.
But one of the first examples he gave us of a technology that nudges is a bench or a window ledge with spikes on it, so that homeless people or anybody, right? Nobody can lie down on that space.
Right.
Comfortable, except maybe a yogi or somebody who can lie on many beds of nature. But the point is, right away we said, well, why would you design something like that? Well, it's to prevent people who don't have a bed from being in that space. Now, you could certainly say we're nudging the homeless person not to spend time there. But I would argue that that's not about making the homeless person a better person. That's a socio-political statement about the fact that we don't like,
We don't like-
homes and places to be sheltered. We don't like to see people who don't have shelter hanging out in spaces.
We don't like to be inconvenienced by the other person's homelessness, which seems a little like more than a little cold and unfeeling.
So there's the morality of the person who's nudged that we focused on, but I think what Francis points out there is there's a big question of
The morality of the designer. Yeah. Yeah, this is why, we can, one of the, I think there are some obvious ways in which we can talk about like moral nudges and immoral nudges. And then this like more subtle thing in between, which is like if I can nudge you to do something that ordinarily we would say is a good action, but you do it in a way without making a conscious, deliberate decision. Now I get a little itchy myself. Garrett, and then back to Heather.
A way that might go back to, I think you said, instrumentalism, the idea that like we apply morality to objects.
Or what objects do is pretty much what we decide to do with them, right? Yeah. That the objects themselves are morally neutral.
An interesting thing I thought of is like when Nobel invented dynamite, he originally intended it to be used in mining to help make mining more efficient and to save the lives of miners.
Mm-hmm.
And then we took it and we were like, this is a great way to like blow people up. So like, and that's an excellent example of something designed like that can be used in a violent way and also in a non-violent way. Like, is the technology necessarily like it gives us both capabilities? So in that case, would you say that the technology is neutral? Or, like, is it nudging us one way or the other? Like,
I was suggesting that theory to poo-poo it later, right? So, like, this idea that technology is neutral, I would say, like, no, it's not. It's not neutral. It doesn't have any kind of inherent destiny to be morally good or morally bad either. It's a little bit flexible. But I don't think I would say that a technology is neutral. Now, so is the question, like, what about dynamite? Is dynamite, like, how would we rate the morality of dynamite?
I guess my question is, like, in cases where, like, you have this thing that opens up, like, two possibilities, but you're not necessarily, like, bound strictly to one or the other. Like, is that just not a nudge? Are you nudged in both directions at once, and it's, like, ultimately up? Like,
Yeah, so this is kind of coming back. I think I would, at least for the sake of this conversation, just insist that when we talk about technologies nudging, we're referring to their intentional design and use, right? Okay. So if we're talking about unexpected uses, right, things that kind of subvert the designer's intent, then I'm not so sure if I would say that any of those were nudged, right? But typically, we do design objects to be used in particular ways, and I think, yeah, you're right that can be a way, that the way that the object is designed to be used is, yeah, it's a nudge. But as far as like unexpected uses that weren't intended, it's like a nudge without a nudger.
yeah, so like I guess in that case, like Nobel, for example, like held himself very accountable, and like that's when he created the Nobel Prize.
Right.
But like he tried to nudge people towards the let's be safer when we mine, and ended up killing people. Like, does he hold the moral responsibility for this technology in that like unintended nudge case?
I don't think so. And like I think there are cases where there are unintended consequences of one's actions, where we would say like, how could you have known? And somebody gets excused from any kind of blame there. There are other cases where I would say like, oh, you maybe should have known better. But I think Alfred Nobel's case is one where we would say like, oh, come on, like he's not responsible for that.
Dynamite doesn't kill people.
People kill people, right? Whereas we might say, like, folks who are doing like particle physics on the Manhattan Project, knowing full well what the like possible applications of that physics were, I think they might be on the line. We might say, like, to hide behind, like, what you do with my science is not up to me, it's for you. I think we can hold people to a slightly higher standard there. To the extent that Einstein was aware of, and like, there's also a whole other pickle about whether or not the use of nuclear weapons to end the Second World War was a good or a bad thing. Anyway.
If you look at the utilitarian perspective, it could potentially like enter into
And this also might be one of those things where I would say, like, it's a tough enough call. Like, if somebody said, like, you could end the war today, but you would do it by destroying 2 cities entirely, and also possibly, like, open up a brand new paradigm for the way that wars are waged.
Well, they wanted to destroy one city, but Japan's just super tough.
That they had to do too.
It's not like the Soviet Union here, and they had to convince it.
That's a tough enough decision that, like, I would say anybody who was in that spot, like, I don't know if they would get a pass, but they would get my understanding. I might say something like, I disagree with you, but maybe I see where you were coming from, perhaps. Yes.
I'm going to make another distinction that might be significant when you're trying to decide whether or not you're going to give somebody moral credit. So some students think about organ donation this way. Let's make that the default. And then if
Right.
you're paying no attention, you donate.
Right.
If you do nothing, that's what you do. But that's different from, say, presenting alternatives, but the one that would be morally best first, but maybe you've got 3 or 4.
Right.
And that they're still, we would say a decision had been made, but it became predictable.
As long as you deliberated, right?
We're going to decide this way. Yeah, but it's also predictable. That's the uncomfortable thing, right?
Yeah.
That more people will decide. But I think that's a distinction worth making. So not all nudges are the same.
Right.
And that you might
Yes.
distinguish them more.
Yeah. In fact, I think that's our task here. Yeah. Anybody else? We're just a little over an hour and a half, which is a nice round number. So yeah, if there aren't a whole lot more questions, we can take the last few.
You said something about stress. I think to me that's very interesting. The idea of threshold. So define stress nudge. And so I'm just curious about an oversaturation of nudges.
Yeah.
Or so much nudge that it pushes back in the same, or if you're nudged in multiple directions.
Well, the idea behind a nudge, I think, is that it's not particularly stressful, right? The coercion isn't quite that hard.
Depends on the technology.
Sure. Yeah. Fair enough.
There are certain times that I think, and this depends on the nudge, they are micro nudges. Talk about
being nudged in a direction that you wouldn't ordinarily go on a repeated basis. And so you're making a decision, or you're not making a decision that you would have that might
It might be. And so would not being nudged, right? If you had to deliberate.
Habit comes in.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have to deliberate because it would be a habit, but if something nudges me in a different direction repeatedly, then I would have to keep trying to think of, it would be counter to how I would normally act.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if acting counter to how you would normally act is necessarily stressful.
It depends, I would think, on how big, like, the deviation from how, like, if how you would normally act is tied up within, like, who you want to be and who you identify with as a person, because then that can create, like, significant emotional and mental fatigue and cognitive dissonance. But, like, otherwise, I would agree with you in that it doesn't necessarily pose a problem.
Sure.
What are we talking about beginning now? I'm still on
I think we've veered into a completely different philosophical problem, which I think is a good sign to maybe call it quits for today. But if anybody is interested in talking about personal identity or talking about any more philosophical problems, we do have a philosophy club here that meets in this room once a week. And any one of the officers want to do a little plug? Denise?
So we meet here 5:30 to 7 every week. Another plug, Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, writing on Black Humor episode discussion. We meet here at 5:30 to 7 every Wednesday, but for the movie we're so
Phillips Room at EUC?
yes. We also have a Facebook page, Easy Philosophy Club. Open to discussion for those that can't make it on Wednesdays. Pretty chill. Come in and we have topics already set up, but if everything like is nudging you throughout the day that you want to talk about any current events, we're also open to talk about.
Thanks, Denise. And thanks, everybody else, for coming out.